Okay, we will move on then to the next day of this Cuban Missile Crisis, which is Friday, October 19th. And President Kennedy left early Friday morning for his trip to Chicago, and he took Kenneth O'Donnell with him. Took him with him. So President Kennedy leaves early Friday morning, October 19th, for that trip to Chicago, and he took Kenneth O'Donnell with him. As President Kennedy was spending the day with Mayor Daley, Bobby called and visited with Kenneth O'Donnell about what was going on during the conversations with XCOM. So as President Kennedy was spending the day with Mayor Daley, Bobby called and talked to Kenneth O'Donnell, and he updated him on what was going on with his meeting with XCOM, because it's Bobby's job to either get a consensus for blockade or invasion before the president gets back. Well, Bobby told Kenneth O'Donnell that XCOM had come up with a consensus for blockade, but he didn't think they would agree to that longer than 1 day. In other words, that tells you that he had a hard time convincing XCOM to go with the blockade, and if he thought he had to go more than 1 day, and how many days was the president supposed to be there? Two. If he went more than 1 day with this XCOM meetings, he thought he would lose his consensus for a blockade, because the military was still pushing hard for invasion. So Bobby said to O'Donnell, you got to get the president back to Washington, D.C. as soon as possible. Okay? Some members of XCOM are going to change their mind, and they're going to lose this consensus on blockade, and we don't want to split. Okay? So Bobby's very serious. He says, Kenny, you got to get him back. This blockade census is not going to last more than a day. If you don't get him back, we can sit down and talk about this. I think we're going to have some people change their minds, and we're going to have a split on blockade versus airstrikes. Well, to make this work, O'Donnell went to Press Secretary Pierre Salinger. Now remember, Pierre Salinger has no idea about the Cuban Missile Crisis. They've kept him out of the loop. Okay? And he's the press secretary. He's announcing the president's movements, so to speak. So O'Donnell goes to Press Secretary Pierre Salinger, who's with him, and he tells Salinger that the president had developed a cold and he needed to return to his doctor in Washington, D.C. Okay? So O'Donnell goes to Salinger and says, listen, the president's developed a cold, we got to get him back to Washington, D.C., he's got to see his doctor. Well, Salinger, do you think he's a little surprised by this? He probably hasn't witnessed the president showing any cold symptoms, right? He has no idea what's going on. And Salinger states to O'Donnell, quote, Kenny, do I get any input around here? In other words, nobody's asking me whether the president ought to go back or not, because they don't want to fill him in. What do you think Kenny's response to him was? When Pierre Salinger said, hey, Kenny, do I get any input around here? What was his response?
No.
Yeah, you can decide how bad the cold is. You can announce that. That's what he told him. And Salinger just kind of shakes his head and announces to the press that the president will be canceling the rest of his visit to Chicago and returning to Washington, D.C. on, quote, the advice of his doctor. So they put up this smokescreen, so to speak, to get the president back, saying he has a cold. Kenny O'Donnell uses Pierre Salinger as his voice, but he will not tell Pierre Salinger why he's going back. And Pierre Salinger's a little bit confused, and he asks if he gets any input, and actually what O'Donnell responded was, yeah, how bad it is up to you. You can decide that. He just was kind of perplexed by it. Okay, that will then take us to Saturday, October 20th. Saturday, October 20th. So the president returns from Chicago, and he meets with XCOM, and they're studying their options. So he gets back, and that morning, the president meets with XCOM, and they began to discuss their options again in Cuba. The consensus is a blockade. Well, the committee meets for several hours. They're still not convinced, especially the military, but finally the recommendation comes out for an official blockade of all ships into Cuba. That's what the XCOM decides. That they will go with the blockade of all incoming ships to Cuba. They will not airstrike. Well, Robert McNamara, gets a little bit nervous about that, and he wanted to make it clear to the committee that we can't call this thing a blockade, we need to call it a quarantine. Do not refer to this as a naval blockade, it's a naval quarantine. Does anybody know why he would be concerned about that language, that terminology, the difference between blockade and quarantine? Absolutely, perfect answer. A blockade is warlike. He didn't want a warlike impression out there. So they would refer to this blockade, is what it is, as a quarantine, because a blockade would be seen as an act of war, whereas a quarantine would not. In other words, you're stopping somebody from advancing, or you're quarantining somebody out because they may have something that will affect you adversely. See the difference? Okay. Now, the question from Kennedy is, what is going to be the procedure for the quarantine once it's officially put into action? The president has to officially put this into action. They're just talking about it now. And they decided that they're going to go with a blockade, call it a quarantine. But what's going to be the procedure once these 25 Soviet ships reach that quarantine line? What are we going to do? Okay? How are you going to keep them from going on, right? So here's the three-part procedure that McNamara explained that would be used for this quarantine zone once it was officially put into effect by the president. He's got to officially do this. He hasn't done that yet. They're talking about it. Well, first procedure is that the United States Navy would stop any Soviet ship that was within 800 miles from the quarantine line. So once a Soviet ship got within 800 miles of the quarantine line, they would stop that Soviet ship. That's quite a ways, right? That would be procedure one. The United States Navy would stop any Soviet ship that was 800 miles out from the quarantine line. Second procedure is the Soviet ship would be boarded and inspected. What are they inspecting it for? Missiles. Yeah, missiles. So the second procedure is the United States Navy would stop that ship and then board it and inspect it. The third part of the procedure for the quarantine zone would be that if any of the vessels were carrying weapons, they simply would order them back to the Soviet Union. They would not do what? Try to what? Confiscate. That would be not good. So the procedure at the quarantine line, the U.S. Navy would stop any Soviet ship that was within 800 miles of the quarantine line. The Soviet ship would then be boarded and inspected, and if the vessel was carrying weapons, it would be ordered back. That was going to be the procedure. Now, this solves half of our problem. What problem does it solve? Any more missiles getting into Cuba. What doesn't it solve? The fact that there's probably 40 already there. Okay? So Robert McNamara further explains, hey, the quarantine is going to stop any more missiles from entering Cuba. However, it will not solve the problem of the missiles that are already in Cuba. Now, what was the hope? I want you to think outside the box. If we stop these Soviet ships peacefully, board them, send them back with their missiles, what is the hope that will solve the problem of the missiles already in Cuba? What's the hope? Think about it. What are we hoping is the good point that ends this crisis? Go ahead. Sort of, and how are they going to give up? Yeah, hey, very good. The gig's up, man. They know we're taking missiles into Cuba. And they're hoping if we stop these missiles going in, very good, my dear, that they'll voluntarily take the other 40 out, knowing, well, gig's up. They know we're putting missiles in here. We don't want any problems. We'll get them out of there. So the hope was that the quarantine would convince the Soviet Union into voluntarily removing their missiles to prevent war with the United States. Now, we got a safeguard. What happens if we stop these ships and the Soviets refuse to remove their missiles like we're hoping they can? What option do we still have? Airstrikes. Okay? So McNamara is saying now, This quarantine doesn't solve the problem of the missiles already there, but we're really hoping that they will voluntarily take them out when they figure out that we know they're putting missiles in Cuba. If they don't, we still have the safeguard of airstrikes. Okay? At this point, I want you to think out of the box again. CIA Director John McCone gets upset and voices his opposition to this quarantine. After listening to McNamara explain just what I explained to you, CIA Director John McCone goes, "Oh God, no, we cannot do the quarantine." Why? Now, Rich, I'd be really amazed. You've been very good about picking this up. But why would he be concerned after what McNamara just said? McNamara said, we're going to solve the problem of the missiles getting in, but we're not going to solve the problem of the missiles there. But we're hoping they take them out. But if they don't take them out, we still have the option of airstrikes.
What if they get mad and they just shoot them?
Well, you're close. What do we lose? What do we have that they don't know right now? The element of surprise. Very good. Very, very good. He's saying, oh my God, if we do this, we lose the element of surprise. First strike capability. They know we know, and they know we're coming. That's going to be much more difficult than if we hit them now and then bring in troops. You see the point there? He's got a good point, okay? So CIA Director John McCone voices his opposition to quarantine, and he believes this blockade or quarantine will eliminate America's first strike capability, the element of surprise. And you said this, and it was awesome. He also stated if the Soviet Union sensed that the United States was going to invade Cuba, they may skip the Berlin scenario and simply launch their weapons. So he was nervous, and he had a good point. So let me repeat that. Not only was he very concerned about the America's first strike capability being lost, or the element of surprise, but he said, hey, if they know we're going to come in with troops and invade, they may skip the Berlin scenario. They may not invade West Berlin. They may just fire these rockets off, and they can hit every major city in the United States with the exception of Seattle. That's his concern. I'll use them or lose them philosophy, right? If we're going to lose them, if they're going to commit an airstrike and take out our missiles, we might as well use them before we lose them. Okay, that was what McCone's concern was. Man, he was a little wound up. Now, this is maybe the best point of the crisis that will come back later. At this point, when things are tense, good old Adlai Stevenson speaks up, and this is what he said. Don't write it down, but listen. He said, quote, maybe one of us in this room should be a coward, so I guess it will be me. Okay? Think about that. At this point, when it's pretty tight, pretty tense, okay, Adlai Stevenson steps up and says, maybe one of us in this room should be a coward, so I guess it will be me. He's going to propose a third option. Now, think about what he said, and what do you think that option is going to be? If you don't want to get in a conflict with somebody, and you look like you're going to, and there's too many loose ends or holes in the tank, what's your best next course? What? Not give up, but you might give up a little, but what do they call giving up a little? What you say? Negotiate. Okay? And what Adlai Stevenson proposes seems so far off that everybody politely listens, but it's just going, are you kidding me? But listen to what he said. He said, let's negotiate. We will give up our nuclear weapons that we have in Turkey in exchange for the weapons in Cuba, and we will also trade Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, which is an American possession. We will give that back to the Cubans, Guantanamo Bay, and we'll give up our missiles in Turkey if they'll take their missiles out of Cuba. We have nuclear missiles in Turkey. You know how far Turkey is from the Soviet Union? Not very far. And they're already there. I'll give you a little sneak preview at the end. This is why they sent them to Cuba in the first place. Is because we had missiles in Turkey and equal distance. What the hell would they bring missiles into Cuba for? Well, because we already had missiles ready to roll in Turkey. So you got to give Stevenson credit. He says, hey, this is a mess. Let's just trade Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and our Jupiter missiles that are in Turkey. We'll just dismantle them, and they will in turn take all the missiles out of Cuba and dismantle their missile launch pads. That was his compromise. President Kennedy listened very respectfully to the elder statesman, but quietly stated to Stevenson that was not a possibility. But he gave it a roll. Now, you keep that in mind when we get done with this thing. You keep Adlai Stevenson in mind. Well, Kennedy then informs the committee that he's going to take time to explore all the options, and he's going to make a final decision on the situation in Cuba, and he plans on going on national television on Monday night and telling the American people not only about the crisis in Cuba, but what course of action he will take. Okay, that's his plan this time. He's listened to the military. He has listened to his committee. He's listened about blockade versus airstrikes. He's even listened to Adlai Stevenson, as far-fetched as it seemed at the time, of trading missiles for missiles. And he said he's going to think about this, and then he's going to meet on national television with the American public and tell them not only about the crisis, but about his actions toward that crisis. He then asked Ted Sorensen to prepare him 2 speeches for that national television appearance Monday night. One speech with what? Airstrike, and one speech with naval blockade or quarantine. So the president then asked Ted Sorensen, his speechwriter, to prepare 2 speeches for his national television appearance on Monday night. A speech explaining the use of the naval blockade, and a speech to explain the use of airstrikes, followed by invasion. He still has not made up his mind, other than the fact he's not going to take Adlai Stevenson's advice. Okay? Well, the president concludes the meeting by thanking the committee for all their advice, and they go on their own way. Well, this is interesting. That night, at a dinner party, Adlai Stevenson just happens to be at this dinner party, and so does Kenneth O'Donnell. And they strike up a conversation. They're talking. And Stevenson's got the ear of the press, and he informs O'Donnell that the New York Times is going to run a story about the situation in Cuba in Sunday morning's paper, which tells you what? Leak. Somebody leaked. And does Kennedy want that out before his speech Monday? No way. I mean, that would be the worst scenario ever. So as Adlai Stevenson is visiting with Kenneth O'Donnell, Stevenson says to O'Donnell, hey, by the way, the New York Times is going to run a story about the situation in Cuba in Sunday morning's paper. Bad news. Now, the story was going to be written by a columnist by the name of James Reston. He was the one that was going to write the story. James Reston. Okay? He was the author of the story, James Reston. And he was going to write about rumors of an invasion of Cuba. And how did he know this? He had been watching troop movements in Florida. All of a sudden, we were getting ready, right? We weren't just going to go in there cold. Ever since this crisis started a few days back, were they preparing troops in Florida? You're darn right they were. And Reston was getting word from Florida, hey, there's some really weird troop movements going on in Florida. And he came to the conclusion that we were going to invade Cuba. My God, do you want that in the press on Sunday morning? That the United States is getting ready to invade Cuba? That screws up everything he ever's thinking about here. Okay? Well, O'Donnell calls President Kennedy and he says, hey, we aren't going to make it to Monday. They're going to run this story in the New York Times tomorrow. And he goes, no way. He said, yeah, I'm telling you, they're going to run the story. So what would you do if you were the president? Why? Do it earlier? Good guess. Tell who? Well, he's going to go a little higher than James Reston. He's going to call the publisher of the New York Times in the middle of the night, Orville Dreyfus. He's going to call Orville Dreyfus in the middle of the night the president. And he's going to try to persuade Dreyfus to hold Reston's story until when? After his speech Monday night. Now that's not, I mean, you guys in journalism class, we have all this freedom of this. I mean, do you have that kind of control over the media? President Trump certainly doesn't. I mean, he's complaining all the time about fake news and whatnot. The media is not really his ally. Okay? One thing Kennedy had was a good relationship with the media. Okay? We talked about the first one to have televised press conferences. He was pretty open with the media. So he calls Orville Dreyfus in the middle of the night, and he says, man, you got to hold this Reston story until after my speech Monday night. Dreyfus really hesitated. He said, you know, you had me hold a similar story on the Bay of Pigs, and it's the biggest regret I ever had. I could have, you know, he could have been pretty famous by running the Bay of Pigs secret story. He says, you called and you asked me to hold the Bay of Pigs story, and I did that, and it's the biggest regret of my life. What am I supposed to tell my writers? What do I say to my reporters, including James Reston, who worked so hard on this story to bring facts to the American people? What am I going to tell them, Mr. President? This is great. Kennedy's response, tell them they'll be saving lives, including their own. Because he thought if that story came out, we're going to war, and we were going to have some casualties. I mean, you think about the domino effect of that. So again, when Dreyfus says, hey, what am I going to say to my reporters who worked so hard on the story? What am I going to say to James Reston? He said, you tell them they'll be saving lives, including their own. Well, after that comment, believe it or not, Orville Dreyfus decided to comply with the president's request, and he said he would hold the story until after his Monday evening speech to the country.